as we go, there's going to be a couple in the next hour or so where we'll open and unmute ourselves and see if there's questions that you have. My goal is to make sure that we address all the specific individual questions that you have. And of course, this is a very interesting time to be diving right into doing skills. It's a time when, for many of us, our hearts are heavy for Lebanon, for Paris, for Japan, all of which in the last 3 days have seen some incredible events, and then for the whole world all the time. And I've been really touched by the responses I've seen on the list that you all are on together, and really starting to think about how connected and even at the root the same so many of the issues are that we're facing. And as women, whether the topic of the day in particular is climate change and the disproportionate way that we're affected as women, and also the opportunities that we bring in our particular wisdom for the solutions, or whether it's particularly about war and displacement, whether people see those things as connected or they don't, we have a particular voice. And as all of you know from the work you do, our perspective and our voices is really, they're essential to the conversation that's going to heal what's happening on the planet. So I just want to start by commending all of you for taking the time out of your day to share some skills. And I know that many of you on the call have been doing this work for a long time, so I'm going to share a few things. But I really want to encourage you at the times when we open up the mics to please chime in. My work primarily has been over the years community organizing in media in climate justice and environmental justice spaces. And I do a lot of training and coaching. I will be in Paris helping to coordinate a team that is building to support the Women and Gender Constituency and also the Women's Global Call for Climate Justice. And there'll be a handful of us working on earned media. This is what we're going to talk about today, reporter relations, as well as social media and images, possibly doing some daily or often, if not every day, dispatches, whether that ends up being a video blog or a newsletter or both. That's it's all taking form, and we'll tell you more about that on the list. But we also have some tools and resources to support you if you're staying in your home country. We would like to cultivate an op-ed strategy and opinion editorial strategy. So Molly, I'm glad you're on the call, and I'd love to talk to you at another point around that. Hopefully you all can see my screen at this point. This was the agenda that we built for this, and we can move a little bit and do some different things if need be, but spending a little time checking in like we just did, and then I wanted to do a bit of sort of a roundtable conversation myself, getting things started, and then opening it to others to talk about media relations and tips for cultivating relationships with reporters and being a spokesperson. I've got a few basic writing tips for you, and then a bunch of resources to send for those of you who want to delve into the nuances of writing, whether it's press releases or pitch notes or op-eds. I think since there's so many new women on the call, we probably will do the 5-minute media training, which is always fun, and I'm going to share with you, and I'll share this PowerPoint and some other handouts, and you can feel free to share this with others. It's just a really quick way, particularly to imagine or reimagine in some cases relationships and power, the way that we interact with the reporters. And if you had only a few minutes to prep someone, this 5-minute media training is something you could use. And then we can talk at the end about how we'll move forward from here to make sure you all have the tools that you need. So that's kind of where we're headed. My goals for coming to you with this today was to open this conversation among us about, what does make an effective media liaison, publicist, what have you, and then start to explore some of these best practices in media relations. Again, many of them are the very same best practices and behaviors we would use to be strong spokeswomen. And then to think about, as we come to the end of the call, a little bit about the media outlets that you think are most important for you to pitch in your area or for us to pitch during the UN talks in Paris, and why. And just as a reminder to ground us in the strategy that we've been using, an acronym called the GAME. And the GAME, the strategy GAME, standing for goal, audience, message, and engagement, is just a kind of a quick and easy way to remember that if we're going to answer these kinds of questions, we want to really ground in first, understanding what our goals and objectives are. And I think of these, as short and long term. You have long term goals and objectives that you've been working toward in your groups and in this process around the climate talks, for many of you for decades, right? And those shift, but the long view that we're in, the long game, is oftentimes the same. And some of those goals might be specific to your organization, some are ones we all share. But being grounded in those and really rooting ourselves in those before we step out to think about the particular moment we're in, the political moment that we're in, is useful. Audience, because obviously, especially in today's world, there are so many media outlets and there's so many different ways to leverage change. So where are those pressure points? Who are we talking to? And for many of you on the inside, you're talking to the delegates, you're talking to other delegations, you're talking to heads of state, you're influencing the process on the inside. And sometimes that happens in the direct dialogue that you're doing in the halls. And oftentimes we can use and leverage the media to make that happen in that sort of strange, twisted, roundabout way where we speak to people through this odd filter that is the media. And then, that in and of itself helps to add pressure even to those powers that be that we're speaking directly to at times. A lot of times, our audience is particular parts of civil society or the general public. Sometimes we need to speak truth to power to corporations. And so in all of those cases, really getting clear, always, what are we doing and who are we talking to now? I feel like our job together, if you should decide to accept it, ladies, is that we have to hold the why. There's a lot of feeling of urgency at times that we need to take particular actions with the media. And for those of you who do this kind of work, you know that you're always holding the why. It's, when someone says we need to do X, Y, Z in the media at this moment, stepping back to ask that question why really grounds us in the game here. We can talk a little bit more about message and messenger as you have the need to today. What's happening so far within the women and gender constituency is you're developing this piece that you have on narrative. And then, of course, in the Women's Global Call for Climate Justice, you have a demand set, right? And women are signing on, people are signing on from around the world to those. As that nuance emerges and those get completed, what we're doing on the media team in the next few days is to begin to turn those then into messages and talking points and imagine how those come to life also, and this is particularly important for all of you, how these goals and those demand sets and the narrative comes to life from your particular perspective, your particular story. And we want to just make sure that all of you, whether it's for your organization or individually, are thinking about and cultivating stories. And these can be stories that take a minute or two to tell, but these can be stories that compress down to a part of your talking point, self-identifying who you are. I've been working with such and such for 20-something years, and we do this because, and therefore I'm here to say, having those pieces that really integrate who you are into the game is also particularly important. And engagement, some of us will be doing media around your interventions. Some will have press events on the inside. There'll be many, many events to capture people's attention that are happening that the campaign will be involved in the streets. And then you at home in your own communities may do solidarity marches or other types of events, and that might be the hook that gets a reporter interested in the story, because as we all know, we have to answer the story for a journalist. Why now? Why tell this story now? But there may be other things to think about engagement.
Celia?
Yes.
Can I just ask, it's a silly thing, but could you put your PowerPoint in full screen because we're seeing it in presenter mode, and I'm
Oh, absolutely. Let me do it. Thank you for. It's always strange um, to be here and not know necessarily what you're seeing. So thank you for letting me know that.
thank you. That's
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I wanted to share this also before we jump into some of the tools because um, this strikes me as something that is just nice to remember and get grounded in. And I think it's particularly important today in thinking about the political moment and how that moment is shifting for us um, with the events that have been unfolding around the world. Um, we're looking as we do our communications to reach our audiences and quite frankly, oftentimes to reach journalists themselves and create a shift in their perspectives and their orientation towards the world around them. And, I always like to just get grounded in that and remember that where we're meeting people oftentimes, whether they're delegates, whether they're heads of state, whether they're folks out at home who will read or watch or listen to our stories, we're meeting folks, and again, the journalists themselves, meeting them in a place sometimes um, of this stagnation, this apathy, inertia, fear, isolation, self-doubt, and we want to be shifting people and motivating people in ways that many of you are very uniquely qualified to do. You have tremendous stories of hope and resilience that need to get told, and transmuting those energies of stagnation to this urgency, anger. It maybe, I'm not a big fan of anger as a motivator, but sometimes is what needs to happen for folks. There's hope, solidarity, and then the last, of course, stands for you can make a difference. And so I share this just to remind us, for me at the meta level, this is what I'm attempting to do with my media work. And sometimes you need to call somebody out who's been a bad actor. Sometimes we need to counter misconceptions that are taking place in the media. And I think as people make meaning of the recent terror attacks, there's going to be all sorts of ways in which people attempt to wield that for continuing the status quo and the power over, and we get an opportunity to think about how we motivate and share our messages in ways that do something else. So getting into some of the specifics of it all, I wanted to share a few things just to remind us, what are we doing when we're interacting with journalists? Why are we pitching? And a lot of us get stuck on this first one of thinking, okay, we're doing this because we need to get the story placed today. We need coverage on this particular issue, or we need them to come out and show up for our event and take photos or what have you. But just to remind us that, many of us, I'm sure, have this phenomenon. I know for me, I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and I started out pitching stories with young reporters my age who were just out of school and covering, environmental issues, and global warming was, I think, how they were talking about it at the time, climate issues for the very first time. And now these folks are editors at major magazines and have been reporting on environmental and women's issues, some of them for as long as I've been doing my work. And, these relationships carry through and can be a very, very powerful part of our organizing and our work, so that's a big part of it too, the long-term personal relationships that we can cultivate. The other thing is that sometimes our news cycles are very short. We're trying to get somebody to do something in this moment, but if we work well with the journalists and we think about it as an organizing opportunity, we can build relationships with reporters for the longer lead time pieces, the feature stories, the bigger exposés, the things that those folks would like to maybe do themselves, but they need a friend, they need an ally to work with them so that they can pitch and successfully land those bigger pieces. And that's another reason that's important to really think about how we cultivate these relationships. Obviously you all are experts in the areas that you work, and for various reasons that's not always known to journalists. So the subtleties of the way we interact with them can help us to remind them or to educate them on the level of expertise that we as individuals, that our organizations, and that this particular group of women, these movements have, and that we're also gateways to the experts. You know, you could fill a whole story yourselves. You know exactly who should be on there. There's, you know, quoting someone from your organization. There's quoting 2 or 3 other women who have different perspectives that can kind of deepen the story. Sometimes you even know who is in the way from getting whatever it is that you want to get done, and you know exactly who that person is if they're going to talk to the quote-unquote sort of other side of the story. And so, you know, not being afraid to step into our power and deepen the relationship, to suggest all of those things, to have sort of the boldness and audacity to do that. And then also the same is true when we think about the story. And I think that if you were to take one thing away from this session, it would be this. Too many of us, I think, imagine that our only role in working with a journalist is to be quoted, and that the only sort of place where we have a right or an opportunity to shape the story is the part that's in quotation marks, or if it's in a radio story, the part where you actually hear our voice on the air saying something, versus the time when the journalists are speaking. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. We actually have the power to shape the entire story, from the headline to the subheadline, to everything that's in that story. And the interesting thing is, as we all know, when folks are reading or listening to a news story, they assume that everything the reporter is saying is fact. And then the part where we speak, they might think of that as opinion. If we're shaping the whole story, then we get a chance to shape, you know, not just the part that people think of as our opinion, but the entire piece and the slant of it. And I think of this as, again, coming at this work as a community organizer first, I think of this as a campaign to organize the media. And if we think about who the media is, right, you know, there are many different reporters and many different outlets, and many of them are have been created by us or friends of us, and they're friendly outlets, and many of them are run by corporations who have interests in perpetuating the status quo, and many of them rely on advertisements from companies who are really pushing the wrong things inside of the UN climate process, right? But we have an opportunity here to reach out to these journalists who are inside of that space and organize them. Many of them are reporters, and I always try to find compassion and remind myself of this when times are toughest in an interaction around a story, or when I'm reading coverage that I just can't believe after all the time we spent, you know, that was what ended up in the paper. I really try to seek that compassion and remember that many journalists started their careers and are doing what they do for the very same reason that we're doing our work, right? Where they really want to make a difference in the world. They believe that journalism is the place to do that. And they've found themselves stuck in a weird institution. Unlike us who work in the NGO spaces, or we work in community organizations, and we have the opportunity to build right relationships with one another. You know, some of you who are delegates know that what this is like, because you're working inside of delegations that are mired in some things that need to change, you know. But in the media, they're mired in all sorts of isms, you know. Inherently, they're still dealing with racism, with classism, with sexism, with ageism, with homophobia, and those things are alive and well inside of those big institutions. But inside of those media institutions are individual people who really want to do the right thing. And if we think of ourselves, fancy ourselves as organizers, y'all know how to do that. You do it all the time in your communities. You do incredible work. That's what we're doing with reporters. We're taking on organizing this odd constituency who we don't get to see regularly at meetings, and we have sort of an odd communication with at times, but we're building what we hope can be individual relationships that can crack open some of those institutional isms. And so that's sort of my philosophy with which I do media work. It's different, perhaps, than other people who just pitch stories and land stories, because I'm actually really trying to do what my mom taught me, which is to, you know, leave it a little better than you found it. And the way that I've been able to imagine leaving the media, especially corporate media institutions, a little better than I found them, is not just supporting a reporter to give me what I want, which is the story that I'm hoping that they'll write, but also that I'm helping to create the conditions inside of those institutions where those folks can show up and be better people. So that's one way of thinking about it. I actually think we can do both at once. I call it my meta vendettas. These are the vendettas I'm on when I'm doing media work with reporters, and I've found that it's that approach that's, when I'm thinking about how can I support you to place my women who you may not have ever heard of, but have really important things to say and incredible expertise and fabulous stories, and how can you see them with the same kind of regard that you look at, I don't know, Christiana Figueres, who has a nice title and has a clear role within the UN process or what have you. That's kind of how I'm looking at these things. I want to make sure that the respect for my experts has been earned, and I as a first point of contact with someone, that's my job. So it's our job to be trained and fabulous and ready to go, have our spokespeople ready to go, and it's also our job and our opportunity, and our challenge to think about how we can relate to these folks in ways that actually shifts power for them within their institutions as well. So I'm going to take some questions in a moment, but I want to share some of these, which are always worth hearing again, although they might seem a little bit simple. The first here is, to be available, and of course to be courteous. But the availability piece, I think, is one of another challenge that a lot of the women that we work with in these in the constituency and in the campaign might face. I think part of the reason why we watch in frustration when some of the larger organizations, and I won't name their names, but you know who they are because you read the articles, get quoted over and over and over. And I think the difference between them and us oftentimes isn't even that reporters know or don't know about us. That might be part of it, but it's also the extent to which we're available. And when you have a huge staff of media people, well-resourced with technology and phones and resources, and they can be available to pick up the phones 24/7, you might end up in a situation where they're getting quoted because reporters are working even almost as bad as all of us in terms of last-minute deadlines, and so I think one of the things that I would recommend, and this is easy and basic, but it's amazing to me how many people don't do it, is to have a number with a phone. Maybe it's a separate phone from every other phone you've got that just never gets turned off and is always being charged. And that's the number that's on the press releases. And you shouldn't have to bear that by yourself. We all need rest. But I've worked on campaigns for years where at a certain time of day, a phone gets handed to somebody and we played past the media phone, and that phone was always going to be answered by the third ring, and that was just how it worked. It may not be where you are right now, but I would encourage us to build to a time where that's the kind of capacity we have, because I honestly think that there are a lot of reporters who want to do the right thing once they know about you and how awesome and articulate you are and how right there on the ground you are living the answers to these challenging questions, and how different that is from someone in a media office in Amsterdam or London. They are going to want to call you, so they just need to be able to get you. These other pieces, which are, again, obvious, but things that it's important to remember and also to share with our spokeswomen, as well as the people who are pitching stories. This idea that we avoid the phrase "no comment," and that there's no such thing as off the record. So just to elaborate on the two of those a little bit, you always have a comment, darlings, right? We all do. We have something to say. It may not sound exactly like an answer specifically to the question that the reporters are asking, but you've got comments. You're full of amazing comments, so don't lose the opportunity to make them. You'll get a question perhaps that you don't want to comment on, but the important thing to remember is that we want to always be answering the question that we wish the reporter had asked, not necessarily the question they've asked. And we'll talk a little bit more about that during the 5-minute media training. But it's you always have a comment and never lose your chance to make it. No such thing as off the record. Yeah, there's a lot of times we might need to talk to a reporter about something, and we're not wanting the details of it necessarily to be published exactly as we are talking about it. So there's a couple of options other than off the record that I just want to speak to. if you want somebody to know about something, it's just not time yet. So for example, if you're putting out a report, or if you have an important announcement about something that you feel is going to be pretty important and it's just not time yet, you could use the opportunity for an embargo. And maybe when we unmute the phones, we can see if anyone's ever used that before and wants to share thoughts about it. But the basics with an embargo is that you say, not now, but if you wait until Tuesday at 3, you can absolutely talk about this. And embargoes are strange, because if one blogger, somewhere, anywhere, breaks that embargo, then the culture of media says that all bets are off, and now is the time to talk about it because one person somewhere has published something about it. But embargo is one way to deal with a time delay. And if folks want more details on that, I can go into that a little bit further. So let me know if you're interested in more when we unmute the phones. The other piece is background, and I think that this is actually probably the most important piece that I can offer that helps when you're looking at how to be in a conversation with a reporter that's maybe not totally on point. If they ask you something that you don't want to speak to, you're going to bridge from what they've asked you to what you want to talk to. If they're wanting you to talk about something and it's very complicated and it's big and it actually is going to take a lot of time to unpack it, it might not necessarily be off the record, but it's not the thing maybe that you want to be quoted for, or it's impossible to be quoted about it because you're talking about, for example, 500 years of colonial oppression that set up the particular dynamics around imperialism and capitalism that have led us to the point where something like a shooting in your community or something could have happened, and that's a lot to talk about, to get into 500 years of colonial oppression is tough to do in a soundbite, right? So you can invoke background and just say, look, this is a great question, and the insight it'll provide really is useful for your story, but it's not really a soundbite kind of a piece. So I want to invoke background, which means I'll talk in some longer form about this, and then I'm happy to come back out of background and give you a quote on this. How does that sound to you? And you get the acknowledgement from the journalist that they understand what you're talking about background, and then you can go into that whole piece and go there, talk about it. When you're done, actually notably devoke out of background. Okay, I'm going to come out of background now, because what I really want you to know is, and then you can go into something that might be quotable in the moment. But I think that between an embargo or background, that can help you to deal with the things that you might need to say that don't quite fit into an interview type format. But everything you say, everything you do, and I have to confess from my own personal experience, even the bumper stickers on your car or the stickers on your clipboard, all of that could be considered on the record. It happened to me where I had a kill your television sticker on the back of my car. And I thought I had parked far enough away from the event as a media person for that not to be a problem. And it turned out that a journalist parked down the street next to me and thought it was very funny that a woman who was trying to get media to pay attention to this critical environmental justice issue in her community had a bumper sticker that said, "Kill your television." So that was what ended up in the story, instead of my quote about what was going on in my community and why we needed justice in that moment. And that was really unfortunate, and that was how I learned sort of the hard way that there's no such thing as off the record. I've also talked to my sisters and my colleagues after a media event in the ladies' room, where you're talking underneath the stall to each other, and there was a female reporter in the ladies' room, and she quoted something we said to each other on the toilet. And so, like, there is no sanctuary necessarily, and we just have to know that. So we present ourselves in ways that we are comfortable with the understanding that all of that could be part of the story. And I hope that none of that ever happens to you, but I just wanted to mention it because I think what happens is, this is an act of theater, political theater, and we get dressed up, whether it's our t-shirt with the slogan on it and our placards or banners, or whether we're standing in a business suit and we're doing our media. I think we think of these performative pieces as an act of theater, which it truly is. But then when we step off of that, when we step away from the podium, when the rally is over, when we've finished the interview with the reporter, we think we're done. And the important thing to realize is sort of with this is that you're always on. And that's why those of us who do reporter relations, media relations work and pitch the stories and interact with the reporters as the first point of contact, need to be courteous, need to be kind, and need to be shaping that story, taking that reporter under our wing from the beginning, and as partly as a shield, as a way to support the spokespeople so that they have a little bit of breathing space, but to realize that it's all on, it's all a part of their attempt to understand and make meaning out of who we are. And rather than seeing that, being resentful or seeing it as burden, when we face that that's true, then we can just make sure that we engineer ourselves to do well through the whole thing. Couple other quick points. I regularly thank reporters. I thank them before the interview happens. They talk to my spokesperson. I thank them after. I will email them when I see the article and thank them, even if they need to be taken to task for some things that maybe need to be adjusted that they got wrong. And in today's world where you have both something in the newspaper and maybe an online story, you can actually get those fixed sometimes. If you express gratitude and then say, hey, I've got some things that I'd love to change, and actually you missed a few facts, or this number is wrong, or, and you can sometimes get those changed in the online version. I've even gotten later updates of a radio broadcast adjusted where the early reports that we heard were incorrect, and then they got fixed later because we connected. And then if it's a good story, I always express gratitude. And one of the things that happens on a regular basis is, I would say, at least once or twice each media cycle, I am told by a journalist that I am the first person in a long time, or the only person sometimes, who has written to them or phoned them or spoken to them with gratitude, as opposed to the people who are always telling them they got it wrong. And, this is just like classic courtesy that, if you had been building alliances with organizations that you hadn't worked with before, and they showed up at your event, you would thank them. It's common courtesy, but it's amazing to me how far this goes with reporters. I've had reporters introduce me to other people saying, this is the gal who wrote me that nice note when I got 53 emails telling me I was a jerk after I wrote that story. Or this is the person who brought me a chocolate bar when my blood sugar was crashing and I still had 2 more stories to wrap up. The small things that we do out of basic human decency, if we can remember the humanity that a reporter is a human being, and see them outside the institution, that stuff has huge, huge impacts over the years. And then the last one of these is this idea that you want to keep it simple, sweetie, and all the time. And I think that this may be the biggest challenge for some of you. You all are so smart, and you're in the ins and outs of the nuances of these various arguments and the bracketed texts and all of that. The ability to step out of that and imagine how you would explain it to a 7 or an 8-year-old child, that's a hard shift to have to make. And those of you who will be bold enough to be doing the media relations and being spokeswomen, you have this dance to do of being able to stand there in those technical conversations and show those folks on the inside that your voice matters and that you are smart and you know what you're talking about. And you all have developed that as a mechanism to survive and excel as women, in some cases as indigenous or traditional peoples. You walked into those United Nations settings sometimes at a disadvantage because that institution has its isms as well and judged you. There was sexism, there was ageism, there was classism, and so you used your knowledge and your intellect in that space to get ahead and to make sure that they knew your voice mattered. And that is absolutely the right thing to do in that setting. The challenge, the challenge and the opportunity now that you have as you embrace doing media work is you have to be able to have that conversation, pivot on a dime, walk across the room to a reporter, and bring it to a level that those of us who don't live and breathe that bracketed texts can understand. And that's the challenge that you're stepping into when you do the media work. It's like doing simultaneous translation. Not everybody can do it, and you can have a great command over a couple different languages, but it can actually be like really hard to do simultaneous translation, right? You're doing simultaneous translation from a level of expertise and technical speak that has allowed you not just to survive, but to thrive and earn respect inside that United Nations space. But you have to find a way through images, through story, through metaphor, through simplicity, to bring that to the general public. And even journalists that you've seen around, the Alistair Doyles or the Arthur Maxes of the world, Suzanne Goldenbergs, whoever they are that you've seen at COP after COP after COP, even those folks, they don't know this process the way that you all do. And they don't know your lives, your challenges, your solutions the way that you do. So the most loving and supportive way to help your community, but also to help these reporters, is to bring it down to a simple enough level that they can understand it. And what we'll be there on the ground to offer, myself, Claire Greensfelder, Lori Kaufman, who will be helping out with media, and some of the media fellows that are coming in as well, is to help preview some of what you might be sharing with folks and make sure that it's at that level, it's coming down far enough. For those of you that will be working at home in the field doing your media work, we can figure out how to support you and be present to you over email or phone. But this is probably one of the biggest challenges and one of the most important offerings that you have. You have a very unique perspective. It's essential that you women get your message out and tell your story. And to do that, there's going to be a certain amount of translation that you have to do. A couple other quick things before we open up the phone. As I mentioned before, to really claim your power in these interviews, I want to encourage you not to answer the question you were asked, but to answer the question you wish that they had asked. What will happen when you do that is the journalist will realize and wish that they had asked that question too, and be grateful that you've answered the question. And we do this in an elegant way without looking like we're avoiding any questions, and we can talk about how that happens in a moment, because this is part of the 5-minute media training. But I wanted to just remind us to always do that as we can. Again, you're shaping the entire story, not just the quote. And that happens they walk up to you and they say, "Why are you here? What are you doing?" And you take a step back and you say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. What outlet are you with?" "Oh, I haven't heard of that newspaper. Tell me about it. Who reads your paper?" "Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you. What kind of a story are you doing?" "Oh, wow, that's great. Who else have you talked to?" "Oh, that's interesting." And these questions, by the way, that I'm offering are part of a handout that we'll send out again on how to prepare for interviews and conversations with reporters. But you notice we've just asked the reporter a whole series of questions before we're really stepping into the immediate answer to theirs. And then you're suddenly in a position where you can see enough of the field to be able to answer some questions and shape the whole story, not just take a quote. Again, you're building relationships and foundations always for features. You're establishing your own an organization and individuals and expertise, and you're working on those long-term relationships. I want to, if you'll help, Bridget, I want to take a moment now and open up the field for questions here. So I know that there's a hand-raising tool that folks can use to do that, and we can unmute folks. But as it relates to this or any other specifics about media relations, I wanted to give you all a chance to ask some questions to respond to them.
Sorry, Celia, I muted you as I was trying to unmute everyone else. So
Yeah.
you just said that you're seeing if people have anything that they'd like to respond to. There is a little hand that you can put up next to yourself if you have any specific questions you would like to have. I'm trying to unmute people. I'm gonna just unmute it. Let's see. And if you have a comment or question, you can also write it in the chat box. Let's see. Molly, Eleanor, Diana, everybody should be unmuted. Yeah, everyone's unmuted now.
So does anybody have any questions, or does anybody, based on their own experience, want to share anything about these sort of, tips and best practices in interacting with journalists? Anybody out there been a journalist and want to speak to that? Looks like
Hi, everyone. Oh, in which order should we do that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That was and then Anne. So Anne, do you want to go first and then Camille?
Okay, thanks. So I have not been trained in media until now, and I've just kind of taken spontaneously demands as in my role as a chair of the French office of WECF. And so this is very useful. So thank you very much, Celia, for this presentation. I have just one question or something I would be really happy of. I had an interview 2 weeks ago, I think, by RFI, which is a French radio, but they have an international section. And it was about a 10-minute interview. And I would be really happy to have some, if you have time to listen to it, to have some feedback from you as an expert on what was good in the interview, was what not so good. So that would be, for me, really useful if I have to take to make further interviews during the COP21, especially on the subject of gender and climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if it's in French, I might ask Claire Greensfelder, who I think is on the call,
in English,
to help. Oh, perfect, perfect. Then yes, I would definitely do that. And what I'll say about this, it's a great point that you're bringing it up. This is an essential piece of the puzzle, and it's often the thing that we have trouble with. Like, I just know I hate the sound of my voice on the radio, and I don't really like looking at myself if I'm on television. But this process that we do with one another to evaluate our own performance and to get advice from others is an essential piece so that we can course correct. And one of the things that we do at the COP is we're doing this simultaneously. As soon as the interview turns into a story, we're looking at it because it's a learning opportunity, and the nuance of what came through and what didn't, or even just what questions reporters are asking. A lot of times I'll ask women to note what they were asked, because even though you're going to speak to the question you wish they'd asked, knowing what they're asking helps you get into the mindset of like sort of what's coming through in the media. And that process, that evaluative process, is essential. But yes, please do email me the piece, and I'm happy to take a look at it. My email will pop up at the end of the PowerPoint, but it's probably also in your inbox somewhere. So yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Great, thanks. It was on Skype, actually. No, sorry, on Twitter. I can Twitter it to you.
Fantastic.
Great.
Camille?
Yeah, I know that we discussed a bit this issue in Bonn in the last training, but I wonder if you can maybe go a bit further into the, how to react when the journalist is asking a question that really we don't know how to answer, or we feel that we don't have all the elements to answer it without seeming to be totally, either idiot or non-expert. I guess what you explained before, the bridging answer can be something to do it. But if you have other tips to share, I would be very interested to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of pieces here, Camille. That's a great question. There's what we are doing, the actual mechanics of how we handle the conversation, and then there's what we do inside of our minds and how we hold ourselves in this, and both of them are equally important, because if we don't have the right attitude about this, it can be hard. And I think that we all grow up, I think, especially as women, depending on where we grow up, what culture we grow up with a little bit of baggage about our how we communicate that is worth healing as we go out to work with journalists. Sometimes we think that, we're supposed to speak only when you're spoken to. I don't know how many women on the call heard that as little girls. I know I did. Speak when you're spoken to, and, answer the question specifically. And then we get into these spaces where we're in a proving ground, that our expertise and our voice matters, and so then we really want to be able to answer the question, quote unquote, correctly and all of that. And so there's some of that that we just get to lay by the wayside. And what we get really grounded in before we come into these spaces is the things that we do know. And there are lots of facts, there's lots of information, there's lots of experience that you have, which creates a body of information that you have. There's also then the work that we're doing together as women, and you're doing it in your communities, in your groups. We're doing it at the level of the constituency and the campaign about, what's important that we all know needs to be said. And as long as it gets said by any of us, it's going to, and it gets out there, then we've succeeded, And then there's your own individual story, the unique expertise and experience that only you can offer that makes you an expert. The fact that you have lived the life that you're living and are doing the work that you're doing makes you uniquely poised to speak to this issue. And so part of the game here, women, is that we've got to believe in ourselves. And you can do a fake it till you make it, where you work on your talking points and you just keep on talking as if you do until it really integrates. But the work that we can do that's probably some of the most important spokesperson training or media liaison training is the personal work that brings us to a place of our power and a recognition that what we have to say matters. And that's probably the topic for another webinar or perhaps a self-help book. So I'll leave it there. But this is a huge piece of it that needs to be pointed at, because that's part of what makes the difference between someone who's good and someone who's great, is someone who actually has the audacity to believe that what they have to say matters and get up and say it. When the journalist asks you a question, however, that perhaps you don't know the answer to, it is not your job to be an encyclopedia of 21 years of conference of parties on climate. That is not your job. You have something to say, but if you don't know the answer, you can say, that's a really interesting question. I don't really know exactly the answer on that, but what time do you need to file your story by? Because I might know somebody who can. Or literally, if you know and she's standing 3 feet away, you can say, I don't know, but my sister from the Philippines over there has been working on this exact thing. Let me get her for you. Do you have a sec? Hold right here. And then you go and you say, hey, this is so-and-so. They're from the such and such paper. They're asking me about blah, blah, blah. You want to come into this conversation? And you invite her in, Otherwise, you might just say, this is interesting. I don't know. But then you never leave it there. And this is where too many of us as women stop. And we stop there because, well, that was a question we were asked, and we've given the best we can. We've referred them on, or we're going to try to get that info to them before their deadline. And then we stop. If you notice, and I don't mean to be stereotypical about gender, but I would say about 90%, 95% of the men that I've worked with never stop there. They do the thing that we all need to do, which is to say, but what I want you to know about what I'm working on is, or something really important here that might be useful for you to know in your story is, and then you speak to the things that you came to speak to. So you're being useful, you're offering to help, you're thinking about whether or not you can find this information for them, but you never let the opportunity go to speak to what you want to speak to, recognizing that. And I've literally quizzed reporters on this. I've been polling them, and when I do workshops, I'll often bring in a panel of 4 or 5 journalists to talk about their lives and their experience. They all will universally acknowledge in those settings, maybe not in the middle of the hall at the UN conference, but in those kinds of teachable moments, they'll acknowledge that half the time when they're asking the questions, they have no idea what the good question is, what the right question is to ask. They're fumbling their way through it. Oftentimes they'll show up to interview you and they haven't even read your materials yet. They really don't have a fix on what's going on. We give our power away to them because they control what comes out the other side of the story. We act as if they're all Nobel, physicists, prize winners. They're not Nobel scientists. They're journalists, and oftentimes they rely on us. By the time you're talking to them, they need you. Their story can't happen without your expertise. And so that recognition and that understanding, not to turn around and feel like you're superior over them, but to meet them as a colleague and a potential ally until they prove to you otherwise. If they write a really terrible story slamming everything we've said, then we can reevaluate our relationship with them. But most of the time, the blunders they make are based in an ignorance that if we can respect and have compassion for, we can hold. And so not only do we lead them toward where they might get the right answers, but again, we speak to the questions we wish they would have asked with the recognition that that's actually the right question, and they may just not know well enough. And it's, there's a game in play, and it's a very, I spoke to this in Bonn, but I'll mention it now, is that, it's a very different style of communication than we're used to. We learn how to do relationships, and we learn that the loving way to be in relationship with someone is to hang on their every word and then do our best to build an answer that really speaks to the heart of their question because we love them and we want to be a good person. That's not the game with journalists. The most loving response to a question from a journalist is the answer to the question you hope they would have asked, to share the materials you've provided and the talking points that you and your group have worked so hard to refine. That's the loving act. But it's different than how we relate to our mates, to our families, our kids, our parents, so we can lose track of that. And again, it's another pivot that we have to make. You are doing a dance between the technical talk in the halls and in the negotiations to this simple talk, much more story-based talk that you're doing with journalists. And it's a pivot between the way in which you would interact with a loved one and the game of communication with them, which is to give them what they need, even if they don't know what it is yet. So hopefully that helps, but I'm happy to take any follow-ups on that if you want.
Camille, can I ask, do you have a specific example of a kind of situation for that? Or is there like a specific type of question that is most jarring?
No, I don't have specific example in mind, but I know that happened to me, sometimes they asked me a question and I was really like, either because I had no idea of what to say or like I was not sure to say the right thing and I didn't know how to formulate, so because if you just say, well, I don't know, as I say, it sounds, like you can lose maybe control and you can appear, or at least you have the feeling to appear as someone that's, not really knowledgeable and doesn't know very well the issue or the topic. So I was just wondering, any tips that can help handle this kind of situation. But I guess Sylvia answered a bit. I mean, I think this is practice and the ability to bridge the question as, and seems natural and something that it's fine. I think it's everything relies on practice. So I hope this will work next time that it happens to me.
A couple of other quick things on this, Cami, is that you can sometimes buy time. A lot of times when a reporter calls or walks up to you, there's a feeling of urgency and you don't want to miss the opportunity, but you can find out when they're needing to write their story and take a few moments to compose yourself. Well, what is it you want to talk about? A lot of times, I don't know if this has ever happened to anyone on the call, but a lot of times we'll get a call about something that's happened and we don't know that it's happened yet. In the United States, our government, I don't know what happens for you all, but our government likes to put out the most important news about the environment and women's issues, at the end of the 15 minutes before close of business on a Friday. And so what will happen is we'll get a phone call that says, did you hear that, Secretary Kerry just said blah, 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 and we have no idea. So you're Googling what just happened while you've got the reporter on the phone. To even be able to put them on hold for 2 minutes or ask if you can call them back in a minute and compose yourself can sometimes make a difference. It also creates in your own body the feeling that it's on your terms, it's on your timeline and not theirs. But the other thing that will help is to think ahead about what you want to talk about and what you want to say, preparing. And then also think about what you'll be asked, because even if you're going to speak to the question that you wish they'd asked, knowing what they might ask you can be helpful, because then there's not a feeling of being caught off guard. But I think more than anything, it's recognizing that there's not really a way that you can do wrong, and that you are smart and that you do have important things to say, and that it's a lot harder to sort of screw it up than I think you might think. And it's not instant recall that you're supposed to be able to be a robot that can just answer a question in a moment that it's asked. There's an opportunity for you to gather your thoughts and put it on your own timeline. You never want to miss the chance. You always want to make sure you have the right phone number, because the one that shows up on your cell phone might not be the number that actually gets you right to them, and those kinds of things. But, the opportunity to compose yourself before you have to answer is totally legit, So maybe that helps also.
Thank you, Celia.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we dig in a little bit deeper? Are we going until half past or until quarter past, Bridget?
It's up to you.
Okay.
I think someone else had a question.
It's Diana Liverman. I have to log off because I have a meeting, but I just posted some info about an event I'm doing on women in climate science, trying to promote women climate researchers at the COP. And I wanted to mention to everybody, including international, not just US-based, the ease of getting stuff onto HuffPost, and then the importance of tweeting when you do get a media interview, and posting to Facebook, because it can really get your message out much more broadly. If you can get it into one media outlet and then retweet it, that can really help. So, but thank you for the tips.
Yeah, thank you for those. That's great. Other folks got any questions? I have a few more things I want to share, and then we can do that 5-minute media training and see if there's other questions, unless anybody has anything they'd like to share right now.
Yes. Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Alina. Sorry, I missed the first part because I kind of joined a little bit late. And I have one question.
Go ahead.
Yes. I got quite an opportunity to do the media interviews before, but then I didn't have any trainings like what to do and how to formulate the answers. So one of my challenge was like sometimes we have like so much of information with us, and there is like short time, and we don't know what to say and how to like pack it in such a way that our answers becomes more relevant and has a key, and also does not miss the key message at the same time. Like, is there any tips on how to make it concrete and like short and simple like we discussed before?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of handouts that we'll send out again with this PowerPoint that were from the training in Bonn that have some tips on this as well. But here's what I'll say in general. One of the things that I would recommend is that all of you look at your calendars now and schedule a couple of sessions for yourselves, maybe, an hour twice before you're leaving to go to the COP, to begin to think about this stuff so that you're not caught off guard. You have these large, big concepts that you're working on, and you know what some of those are. Like the demand sets, for example, or the things you're working on, you know what some of those are right now. We're talking about 100% renewables. You might have a certain time by which you want that. There's the 1.5 degree piece. There's opportunities for particular kinds of solutions that are driven and led by communities that are local and site specific and make sense. There's all of these sort of nuances of the things you want. There's an analysis of how the world is and what the world needs to become that you already know. And no matter what happens on day 1 or 2 or 3 of the COP, you know that there's some things that you want to say. And maybe there's a story of a particularly inspiring solution that you're creating in your community, or an example of what it means that women are on the front lines of climate, or even an articulation for yourselves of how you think about the difference between climate and climate justice. Some of that is in you. It's just stuff that you know. But it's about taking the time and sitting down and writing out some notes on what that would look like. The narrative that the Women and Gender constituency is working on will turn into some talking points that you could use if you wanted them. The Women's Global Call for Climate Justice has demands, and those can be talking points as well. But to sit and take the time to imagine what you would say, and what I would say is in each of these talking points or sound bites that we're thinking about creating, you're going to have your own personal bite, who you are and why you do what you do and why your voice matters. And that can be 7 words between some commas. It can be a couple of sentences, but it's something that you are always going to say that places you as an expert and that identifies who you are in this larger story of what's going on at the COP. Sitting down and writing those out and thinking about them and shortening them as if you were writing a love poem to your beloved, like to a haiku, something with precision, and then taking the time to hold a watch that has a second hand and just notice how long it takes you to say it. And then suddenly there you are and you're saying, oh, okay, if I want to talk about this thing that's happening with this water project in my community, it takes me about 40 seconds to say that. If I add on this little piece about who I am, that's about a minute. Okay, well, can I do that shorter? What would that look like? And to have some things that are in 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minute chunks that you can speak to and have them in advance is really helpful, because otherwise we're flying blind. We're in this vagueness of, I don't know how long it takes me to say that. The other vagueness you have to get out of is how much time you have. And when you're with a radio journalist, a lot of times it kind of feels like I could just go and go, but you actually want to know, how long is their story? Are they just taking your chunks and they're going to put you on the air as if it's a conversation between the two of you? Or are they going to have to go cut everything you just said? And how long do they have to do that? And when you understand what they're dealing with, what their constraints are, how long they have until they're doing their story and how much space they have for their story, then you know, oh, I got to go with a 30-second here. Or, oh, they want me on the air live for 15 minutes in a conversation. I can go off here and, or I'm going to be on a panel in a debate. I can really unpack this. So knowing the media constraints that the reporter has and what kind of a piece it is, which if you're at the COP and you're working with us, myself or Lori is going to come to you and say, this is who the media outlet is, this is what they're working on, this is the kind of story we're noticing they've been writing, this is the opportunity to shift that, this is how long you have. Are you interested in doing this interview? And then you can choose. But when you're doing it for yourself and somebody walks up to you, in a very quick moment of time, you want to ask them 4 or 5 questions that helps you get that info. And the handout that I'll send has that, it literally says, before you answer a reporter's questions, ask them some of your own. And it has these 4 or 5 questions that you ask to sort of establish how that works. And in terms of making sure you're not sort of missing the key messages, one of the things I do is I'll test my message. And I don't have money for fancy polls or anything like that, but I'll ask a friend, oftentimes it's been my dad or my cousin, to just like listen to me say some stuff and see if it makes sense. And it helps me then to realize, where am I coming into the conversation with my message, assuming people have too much background information already, and then like, how can I make sure that I'm talking about this in so many words? And there's certain things we know that make it better, like, for example, not speaking in acronyms, so you can't go in and say, we're from the, the WGC, and we're talking about, blah, 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 and give a whole bunch of acronyms. You want to spell it all out. But that's just one way that we make sure that we're speaking in simple enough terms. Having somebody to bounce ideas off of is helpful. And at the COP, if you're in Paris, you're going to have us. You're going to have myself and Lori and some of our media fellows to bounce ideas off of and prep. And that's what we're there to do, is support you. And then, it's about building at home or building, in your networks, folks that you can bounce those ideas off of so that you understand, and you have to sort of step back far enough to imagine, if this was a fairy tale story, am I telling the elements of the fairy tale so that everybody understands who's the hero, what happened, how the hero's going to save the day, at that level of simplicity when you're unpacking it? Or if it's facts and figures or complexities around, funding for technology or whatever, am I explaining the nuance between what they're offering and what we're demanding instead, in a way that people get it, and having somebody to bounce that off of can be super helpful. But it's also really about taking the time, because if you imagine yourself, you sit down for an hour and that's already in your calendar, and you're thinking about, how do I take the stuff I'm working on and explain it to an 8-year-old, you can get there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Looks like Claire has her hand up also.
I do, but I'm muted.
Oh, you're not anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I've been offline with computer issues, but I had one comment on the relations with reporters that you mentioned, Celia. The experience I had at the women's conference in Beijing years ago. The minute I got there, it was a 3-week-long event. I made friends with the reporter from the main paper from my town, which is the San Francisco Chronicle. She had been assigned a particular beat at that conference, and it was not the beat I was doing. It was not environment. She was following gender identity issues, both LGBTQ. So even though I pitched her a lot of stories and gave her a lot of press releases, she never ran my stuff because it wasn't what she was assigned from home. But so what I did is I made friends with her and I kept feeding her things, and she'd ask me what I knew, and I'd feed her on the stories that she was looking for, even though they weren't what I was doing. On the very last day of the conference, I ran into her in the hotel, and she invited me to have breakfast with her. Over the breakfast, we were just talking, and I said something, and she said, "Wait a minute, what did you just say?" And I said it again. She said, "Repeat exactly what you said. You just summed up the whole conference for me." And she ran it as a lead in the paper back home. So, it was really a surprising moment that we just remained in the relationship. And there I was just trying to understand the fact that it wasn't her job to cover the issue I was doing, but ultimately she ended up doing it because we had developed a relationship, and at the end she heard something I said that made sense to her. So you can also be helpful to them if they need information about something that you're not doing, but as Celia said, you know someone who is. It doesn't mean that they ultimately won't quote you or take you in. And that was a really instructive experience for me, and I've made an effort ever since then to always seek out the reporters from my home papers and make sure they know what I'm doing and then help them with what they're trying to do.
Thank you so much for that. I want to share the last couple of pieces because I have been teasing you and promising you the 5-minute media training, which I want to make sure we do, and then we'll take a closing round of questions and comments. I think I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody just for this next section, if you would, Bridget. Go
ahead, Celia.
Thank you. So a couple of other quick things to share before we do another round of sharing from all of you is that, if you are staying at home, here's some tips to think about, but this is actually something that's true for everybody, wherever you're going to be, Paris or at home. This is an incredible opportunity that we have, and it's in some ways one of those things that's bittersweet. Like, we're going to have 3 weeks of 2015 where reporters are actually prioritizing talking about climate. Now, they should be doing that every day, and some of them are doing it more and more, but we do have this opportunity. And in thinking about your own individual stories that you might do at home, or your own individual story that could be told in Paris, just a couple of things to think about. And again, I've sort of spoken to these, but I just want to reiterate them because they're kind of the classic sort of bread and butter of media. Keeping it timely. So connecting what you're talking about to other stories and issues. If you're working on anything related to climate and you're going to be at home pitching from your home country, this is your timely moment. If you're inside of the COP process, the danger with this idea of keeping it timely is you all are living and breathing, again, every little decision, every little negotiation, every little bracketed text. The tendency is to believe that the time horizon that the whole world is on is like that. I don't mean that timely. I mean timely as in general, we're thinking about climate. There may be something happening in the negotiation that needs to be talked about in this moment today. But for many journalists and many people learning, they're going to tune in on day 5, and it's going to be the first time after all of this, seeing it in Twitter and their Facebook feed and hearing about it on the news, that they're finally saying, what the heck's going on with the climate at the UN in Paris? And they're paying attention for the very first time. You've been there for 5 days or 21 years, depending on the work you've been doing, right? And for you, this is this huge, thing, and the little teeny shift that happened in the moment is really, really important. Don't forget that everybody's sort of dropping in at different times and different levels of depth and expertise. But this generally, it's timely in this, starting now until Christmas or solstice, we have a window to talk about these issues. Timely is great. You've got that going for us. And now let's talk about keeping it local. This goes in 2 directions. How does the large international story of climate negotiations in Paris affect your community directly? And then the other way around, how does what's going on in your community relate to what's happening at that international level? Is it an example of what's right? Is it an example of what needs to get changed? Is what's happening in your community exemplary of a trend, or something that should be replicated, or something that everybody needs to understand actually is related to climate because maybe they think it's not? You know, whatever it is, you get to play with these pieces, and you can take an international story and localize it, and you can take a local story and nationalize or internationalize it. And part of what's amazing about the solidarity and the work that you are already doing in this coalition, in this sisterhood, is it naturally lends itself towards the opportunity for you all to be able to take the story of your own particular situation and make that story very, very popular now, both locally and larger. So that's the moment we're in. And how do we do that? I mean, sometimes it's as easy as the way we talk about things. You know, you might talk about what's going on in your community and the solutions that you've created to meet the energy needs that you have in a way that's sustainable, and then you can say, you know, but here in New Delhi, we're just one of thousands of solutions that are popping up all over the world from women like us who are taking the initiative to create a livable future, whatever it is you want to say. You can say, I'm here in solidarity. You know, I'm standing here in Anchorage, Alaska, but I am in solidarity with my sisters in Chile and all the way to New York and all the way to Japan, and we stand together to call for XYZ. You all do this all the time, right? It's the way in which you think about, you're oriented towards that style of organizing in solidarity. You see yourself as part of a constituency, as part of a campaign. So don't forget to say that. And then that helps to cue the reporter, like, oh yeah, this is big, and it helps them to understand why the story needs to happen, you know, timely, why now, and then the scope of the story, you know, why this story. And this is also the kind of conversation with a journalist that gets you from a one-off story that's small to those larger stories. You're helping to make meaning for them and for them to see the context. And then the other piece, which is always critical, is this idea of making it personal. And how do you do that? And again, it's like, you know, if you put some time now on your calendar to sit and think about this, you could come up with a couple of lines that you're working on of how you're going to personalize this, or how you'll tell the story of your 15 years of working on this particular solution in a few sentences. And when you're playing with it, drop us an email. Drop me an email and say, hey, this is what, you know, this is where I'm from. This is a link to my group. This is what I'm thinking of saying. How does that strike you? But the work on this, whether you do this to be better at home, or whether you do this to be that much more crisp and articulate at the COP, you know, both of them I think are valuable. The tips that we've shared already are actually really some of the same tips that carry over into writing. You know, we've spoken them in the context of pitching stories to reporters or being a spokeswoman. They are really also true in writing op-eds or blogs or articles. This idea of being timely and relevant, of being able to, when it's appropriate, express the emotion that is appropriate. And again, this is another thing. When you're inside in the negotiations, you have to have a game face, a poker face, right? You're fighting over these bracketed texts and things, and you're going to be very careful the way, especially as a woman, right, how you wield your emotion in the space, because unfortunately we live in a world where that can be judged as unprofessional or weak or what have you. There's a time and a place for the appropriate emotions, and you're good at doing that. You know how to do that in that space. When you step out and you're going to do some writing, or you're going to be quoted, or you're going to do an op-ed, it's a chance for you to really go somewhere with what's true, and let the emotion that's appropriate for that moment, whether it's celebratory or it's taking somebody to task, let that happen. You know, and I think that it can be done well and done professionally, and it does not undermine or compromise your ability to then walk back into those negotiations and be effective. I would say that you wielding the appropriate emotion and sharing it in that moment will garner you the respect from journalists that then puts you at a higher respect inside of the negotiations. And I think the classic example of that, you know, might be the leader from the Philippines who gave, you know, that very, very impassioned speech, you know, at the UN talks right on the heels of the incredible climate disaster that was unraveling in his country, and he was emotional. That's the appropriate thing to do when people are dying, you know, to actually feel that. And it was incredibly, you know, compelling. But there is something that only you can say, and it's oftentimes something in your particular way from where you're sitting. It's oftentimes something no one else is saying, and to not be afraid to do that. And in terms of some of the more nuts and bolts tips, we'll send out, along with the spokesperson tip sheets and the webinar PowerPoint, we'll send out links to tips and samples of some writing materials and things that walk you through step by step what are the elements of these. And if anybody's interested in writing a blog and writing op-eds and wants support around that, that's part of what we're here to do, is to make sure that you feel like you have somebody who can talk you through it at the start, can help you copy edit, whatever you need so that you can get things done that you want to get done. And again, we're going to send more detail on press releases, so I'm going to sort of skip this, because what I want to do now is spend a couple minutes on this thing that I've been alluding to, which is the 5-minute media training. We'll do this real quick here, and then we'll open up again for some parting thoughts from you all. And so this is the ABCs, maybe plus F, and this is the 5-minute media training. This is what we were talking about before, about the idea of having power and taking the question that you are asked and pivoting to and speaking and answering instead the question you wish you were asked. And it's the ABCs stand for acknowledge, bridge, communicate. And it's literally as simple as, that's a really great question. I've acknowledged the question. What I really want you to know is, I've now built a bridge, and then boom, here's my talking point. Or, that's a really interesting question. I want to get some more info from my friend so-and-so on that question. But the question no one's asking, or the thing that feels most critical at this moment for me, or another bridge that's also sassy, that just shows how smart and important you are and amazing, is to be able to say, you know, that's an interesting question, but having just walked out of the negotiations, or having just walked out of a spin-off meeting on this very topic, what I can tell you with certainty is, I mean, now I'm leaning in and I'm drooling and I can't wait to hear what you said. And that was simply just your bridge, but it also established your expertise. So it served and showed why you're the one that they should be listening to. That's a simple process. Acknowledge, bridge, communicate. It moves you from feeling like the reporter is in control and you are their, you know, trained servant who has to jump and deliver the answers, you know, to now you are driving the process. The last piece is something that is useful all the time, but it's particularly useful if you're on live radio. It's particularly useful if you're talking to a radio reporter or a television reporter who has to go and edit what you've just said. It's also really useful if you are talking with a reporter who is not taking notes. I don't know if any of you have ever had this happen, but one of the most frightening things I've ever experienced is you're sitting there and you're saying all your awesome stuff. You're saying exactly what you thought was the most incredible, important soundbite, and the reporter's pen is not moving. They're not writing. And it can be crushing. Like, oh my God, they're not writing. This is the best stuff I've got. What do I do? So flagging wakes the listener from a passive listening to an active listening. And I did my flag actually as a bridge earlier, but it's simply a phrase that gets somebody's attention. Anybody who's a mother out there or has been a school teacher is an expert in flagging. We do this with our kids all the time, right? But it's literally something like, what I really want you to know is, or the most important thing here is, or any candidate that wants to get elected in the next presidential campaign better realize that, you know, those kinds of things that make people stop passively listening and move them to an active listening. So if your bridge can also be a flag, then you're really cooking, you know. So thank you for that question. Very interesting question. I think the most critical thing that we're facing here at this moment in these negotiations, both a bridge and a flag, is, and then boom, you might be communicating the same talking point that was relevant to you the day after tomorrow when you sit down and you spend an hour thinking about what's going on and what's at stake in your community and in Paris. but you've acknowledged the question, you've flagged and bridged, and now you have the reporter's attention, and then you're saying that same thing. And if it's still the right thing to say, great. Bridge off the question and flag it so the reporter hears it. Literally, subconsciously, what happens in their head when you say something like that is, oh, this is the time I'm supposed to write. Or, oh, I should note the timestamp on my recording right now, because this is the part I'll have to cut. Literally, that's what the brain does when you flag. So that's the 5-minute media training. Take it, use it as your own. And I want to just open the phones back up as we get ready to part ways and take any burning questions. This isn't the last time I'll be available to you. It gives me great joy to be available at any time. And Lori Kaufman will also be on the team and available in Paris. But if there's any parting thoughts or burning questions that we can't stand to leave without having answered, let's take those. Sorry about that. I think that's a PowerPoint noise, believe it or not, on my PowerPoint. It's horrible. So questions? Or final comments?
Hello, hi, Celia. This is
Yes.
Sunita.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I just yeah, and thank you. It was a very interesting sharing. You see, as I sit with the delegation, and I come from the umbrella body of women's organizations from Malaysia. What is a little bit taking me back is how do I represent myself, because not all of these climate issues are well understood by even the women's group themselves. It's not their priority. For me to even work with them, it has taken me for the last 2 years to actually let them understand what the issues are. And to see the connections with their work. So in that sense, when you're talking about engagement with media and so forth, the balance of trying to not also make them uneasy is also very difficult for me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So is there a way forward to this? Because yeah, for me is what I've done is I've prepared certain, like you say, certain points which I will be taking into consideration, which I think would be important as we go to COP. I've given and I've shared with them, but just to not intimidate also the group that I'm working with, because this seems to be so huge and it's way out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. This is a great question, because a lot of times there's a question of like sort of how ready is our group to do media right now. And it sounds to me like, in a way, one of your audiences, when you go back to the game and you think about goals, audience, message, engagement, for you as a messenger, one of your audiences is the group itself. It's your internal communication that has to happen, and bringing those questions, bringing that education to help create comfort inside of your own group might be part of what you're going to need to do. There's a couple things that I'll say, though, because I know you well enough to know that it would be incredibly powerful to have you in Paris and wherever you are speaking to the media, and that we need you. We need you to step up. And so I'll say a few things on this. One is that oftentimes creating a process within the group to or talking to the media, or jealous that you're the one that's doing it, or whatever that can come up. I know in some circles I run in, people really have a lot of disrespect for the United States media, and they don't want to interact with the media at all, because they feel like they're sort of part of the corporate capitalist imperialism machine, and unless you're doing your own blog or talking to a a radical anarchist, magazine, then it's not an appropriate thing to do it at all. There's all sorts of reasons why the group might not support you, but it's very valuable and important to have the support of the group if you are going to speak. So thinking about that as an internal organizing opportunity, as an internal audience, and how do you sort of help them to know what the issues are and to understand why it's important to speak to them, and to help get to create a process where the group feels comfortable with and is part of creating the messages that your spokespersons end up carrying forward. And sometimes it's not always appropriate, for a particular person to be the one to speak. For me, when I'm doing media, I'm in service to this group of spokeswomen. My goal is to never get quoted. If I can help it, I'm going to never get quoted. Even though I've done a ton of television, I could do radio. The bigger the crowd, the better. I'm a ham, like put me in an arena and give me a microphone, but it's not my job in this moment. It's my job to support all of you. And unless there's a critical deadline where we're going to miss it, if I can't find someone, my goal is to never get quoted. And to support all of you. But for someone like you, it may be that you are the right person to speak. And the question is, how do you create the conditions inside of your group, your collective, your organization, so that that can happen? And
yeah, that is, well, yeah, thank you. But besides the group also, then you also have the government delegation, which I'm part of right now. And also you have to create a sense of trust with them. Yeah, but at the same time, you don't want the issues to be sideswept. It's very critical issues for the women that I work with at the ground level, at the grassroots levels, and that's one of the reasons why I've decided to go for this COP. In particular. Yeah, so that is one of the things that I'm juggling. But like for me, I have taken, for example, for this year with the environmental groups, we've got a radio talk which I go on every month to be interviewed, and tomorrow also I will go on air. So just to practice, and that has been very useful in that sense. But then trying to bridge all these things. So maybe as we go to COP, I'm glad to know that you're there and to look for you also, because also providing this capacity building to our for example, the women's ministry to be the spokesperson rather than me myself is also important.
Yeah, and I don't think you're the only one that's doing this juggling as being an official part of the delegation. And I don't know if Bridget or Claire, if you guys have feedback on this, and we can also talk about it when we get to Paris, because there's a lot of sort of on the job learning that can happen. But there is a dance to do there, and you identify yourself and where you're from, but that doesn't mean that if you don't have other affiliations that those won't be found out, and it's possible you could be quoted as being an official delegate as opposed to a member of such and such an organization. And so there is a question there. But here's what I would say about this. You all know the specifics of this better, and you have a long game to play and a reputation inside of those spaces to protect. But it strikes me that this particular COP, unlike any other, at least since Copenhagen, but maybe not at all, is an opportunity that your voices are desperately needed. And if there are protocols you need to go through to get permission to speak, or if you have to always say, I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my organization, not in any other role that I play, or whatever it is, it's worth it to think about how to do the logistics on this to bring our voices in. Because one of the things that's happening is that it seems like, in the same way that climate justice emerged in COP 14, 15, 16 as important, the same way that indigenous rights have been elevated inside the UN, that this is kind of the year of the woman's voice, and that people are recognizing that this women and gender perspective is essential. And you're starting to hear, older white men from big organizations talk about it, which is great. I love that our allies at 350 and Sierra Club and WWF are recognizing that your voices matter. What we don't want is for the media to have more white men talking about how women's voices are important. We want your voices, right? And how do we get that? And not everybody's going to play this game. You all understand your own sort of strategy, and I would encourage you to talk with Claire Greensfelder, to talk with Bridget in great detail about this nuance. But to the extent that you can step out and still be safe in your official role if you're in a delegation, it feels to me like we need you this year, this COP, more than ever. And so let's do this dance together and figure out how to make it work so that it actually helps boost your positioning, not compromises your positioning, but still allows you to be a speaker. And I think we can look to the small island nation delegates, to the Africa group, almost always, but particularly in Copenhagen. You know, even the like-minded. There are people inside those delegations that even heads of state who say incredibly radical, like front-line types of things that end up shaping the far edge of what's possible in the COP. And they are official delegates. They're heads of state, for heaven's sakes. So what's the opportunity here, you know? And I can't answer that for you, but I promise to sit with you on a fluffy couch somewhere on day one, you know, at our meeting on Saturday and figure this out. And I see that Ann and Carmen have hands as well. I want to grab them before we part ways.
I'm not sure that anyone can hear me anymore. Celia, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, I'm Zainabu from Burkina Faso. I'm sorry I get you very late, but yes, I'm following you so I would like to thank everyone to know if I can have a summary of this webinar, because it's very useful. And actually, you have to face the reporter and journalist for interviews.
Yeah, we have a bunch of goodies we're going to send out to you, and you'll have my email as well, and I am available over Skype and email to in the lead up and during Paris. So please definitely take advantage of the opportunity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can anyone?
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, I can
Thank you so much.
Yes, Bridget, I don't know if people can hear me. For some reason, I'm having trouble. We're just going to really need to wrap up the call now. I'm sorry, I was trying to make the intervention. I see that Carmen has her hand raised. If you could make a really quick point, and then we're going to have to wrap up, and we'll send out a summary for everyone. And I'll also add a link here for the spokeswoman document. As many of you know, we're collecting information on everybody, and we really need this in terms of media relations. So please fill that out. But Carmen, if you have a quick comment, please go ahead.
Okay.
I just want to, make sure that in Paris we're going to have like all the support, and that we're all going to be able to have like a team that's going to do all the outreach and the media and the networking.
Yeah, I think you might have joined late, Carmen. So I know that when we talked in Bonn, I was not planning to be there, but I will. Myself and Lori Kaufman will be helping with media relations. We have a couple of media fellows, younger women from the Global South who are going to be with us, who are building their skills in media and social media. And there'll be at least one representative from Project Survival Media who will shoot video and stills and be available to us. And Claire Greensfelder will also liaise and be a part of that team along with the other work that she'll do on the ground. So, and anyone else who wants to, if you have young, emerging media stars that are coming, or even if any of you want to plug in, we can definitely use the help. But we will have the capacity, and you'll get to meet all of us at the meeting on Saturday, the first day, and we'll establish where we're going to be and how to connect. We'll start the day with you in your morning meetings, and then go from there. And so, yeah, we will have some support to do this at a higher level, I think, maybe than you might have had at the last few COPs.
And Claire, did you want to just add a quick word before we close?
Yeah, just one thing I think that some of us should do is, I think we'll probably get asked questions about the priority of climate change globally, and it's going compared to other issues that are going on, and I think it's going to give us a really good opportunity to make the links between displacement and refugee situations that have been caused by climate change that are exacerbating global peace. And I would just encourage people to think about also what you think about global peace, and I think we should work on some talking points together, because I'm sure we'll get asked that question, and it gives us a good chance to really think about how we want to frame the dramatic nature of climate change and how it's impacting everything. It's a good opportunity. It's a difficult one, but it'll be an important one. So I'm just putting that out there to think about.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
Okay. I think if that's all, Celia, do you just want to say a word to close? And we have a recording of this entire webinar, which we'll send out shortly.
Yeah, just in closing, I'll see you in Paris. If you're not coming to Paris and you want some support, let me know. We did acquire the access to a media database that is really robust. And so if you live in a particular country and you're interested in a list of which environmental or women's issues reporters cover those issues, have sort of self-selected and said, yes, I write about those issues in your home country, send me an email and we can build a list for you. The lists are dirty, and what that means is that some of those reporters may not work there anymore. Some of them really may or may not be writing from the perspective that you're hoping for. We don't know who those folks necessarily are, but we can pull a list that comes in a spreadsheet and send it to you that you can call from and notice, are there outlets that you're not taking advantage of, or people that you didn't realize are covering these issues in your home country. So if you're going to be at home and you want some help with a media list, please hit us up. If you're coming to Paris, we're going to send out all these tools, and I'm going to send out my dream homework assignment. If I was your media professor and I could give you homework, there's probably 3 things I'd ask you to do before you get to Paris. I know you're busy women, and if you do them, if you have time, that's great. But I'm going to send it to you so you know my thought of how you could spend a few hours between now and when you land prepping to be part of this media work in some way, even if it's just offering advice. So all of that will be coming from us later today. Look for an email from Bridget with all of those goodies. And thanks for taking time out of your day. Again, I understand how busy you are and how important your work is. And so I want to congratulate you on investing in yourself and thinking about how to build your own voice as a spokeswoman. And thank you for the work you do in the world.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.